people that are,
Perfect. I've started recording.
yeah, there are people that aren't able to be here tonight. They're curling. Somebody sent an email saying he was called out for curling as if he had to go to work. And I thought that's kind of interesting phenomenon. So, but thanks for signing up for this kind of conversation. You all have gotten the slide material and other material that we've sent out. I'm here with Greg Eisenhower from the TCC and the GNCC head ice technician, and Ian McCauley, who's from the RCMP Curling Club in Ottawa. And so we wanted to talk about ice maintenance. So the plan is to really not spend a lot of time talking about the material on each slide. We'll stop on the ones that are marked in red. If anybody wants to stop on another one, just raise your hand or jump in and say, hey, I got a question about that. We'll just kind of move along. There's a couple other slides I've added today after a couple other things came up. So, but I would say right now, we'll just kind of go through this and see how we get. So I just want to encourage any of you to feel like you can chirp in at any time with other questions if things have come up since you registered or since we sent out any materials. There's certainly things we can chat about. And if anybody has any thoughts or ideas of things that we talk about and they would like to add to the conversation, feel free. So, oh, why isn't this working, Dan? I don't like this.
You see your screen. There you go.
There we go. Okay, good. That's good. Okay, so most of the things we're talking about come out of the OCA Ice Technicians Reference Manual, World Curling Ice Explained, or articles from the Scottish Curling Ice Group. So the first thing we thought, this was one of the last things we put in the slides, and we just think it's really important, whether you're a paid ice technician with 2 or 3 employees, or whether you're working as a volunteer in a club and you've got 6 or 8 people, that it's important that you all communicate, people communicate within your team. There's lots of different ways to communicate. You know, there's logs that people need to look at. There's a bunch of different things, but it's really important that you have a way that you consistently communicate with any of your employees, volunteers, or anyone that is involved in helping with the ice. Anything you want to add, Greg or Ian, about that?
Yeah, no, just as Russell said, you know, when you're working with a group of people, you know, it really is, it's very important to make sure you guys are communicating on a daily basis of, you know, what you're doing out there and what you're seeing and what you're adjusting for. It's very difficult to see these kind of little changes in the ice over time if you're only coming in and scraping and pebbling once a week. So you really do have to rely on that sort of everyone kind of understanding what they're looking at and then communicating it to the rest of the group, so that you guys can respond to things in a timely fashion. So communication is key, whether you're writing it down in a notebook and everyone's checking that notebook day to day. You should have a scraper log that shows what you're doing, what patterns you're using, what turns you're doing, how many turns on the blade, and then just, you know, talking with the main people who are doing your ice for you on a day-to-day basis, and just letting them know, oh, I think we got a low spot developing over here, so let's work on this for the next couple of days, or you know, whatever it is that you're seeing out there as an ice tech. Try to communicate with your team pretty regularly and clearly.
So Ian, you're muted, but if you have anything to say, just unmute yourself and speak up.
No, I agree with what you both said for sure. Especially get a bigger group. If you have a smaller group, it's easier to communicate with 2 or 3 people. When you have a bigger group, it's even more important, because one guy's doing one thing and next person's doing the next, and everybody's pebbling different and whatnot.
So to me, one of the things that I actually kind of keep myself is sort of a personal ice log. And I really keep it because it helps me as a player, all right? And this is an example of sort of the notes that I try to keep occasionally as I'm trying to understand what the ice is doing. I think it's helpful in a way. I like to have other markers in mind. Usually it has to do with something I played, who I played with. I had a game 4 years ago with Michael Ryback on sheet 3 at Broomstones, and we both noticed the same thing, that all of a sudden our ice was really curling very differently than what it had been in the past 3 weeks. So there's ways for you to kind of keep some ice log that tells you how your ice is changing over time. I think this is a really important thing to do. The frequency's up to you. I'm not sure how many people do it. I know we keep other things, but I just think you want to be able to look back over the season, at the end of the season, look back into October and November and have a pretty good idea about how your ice changed, and that it reflects as close as you can an approximation to what it really was. This is pretty straightforward. So some of the things that affect how your ice changes or how much it changes are these things. Pretty straightforward in terms of what they are. There might be some other things in your club that are specific. How proficient your pebblers are at pebbling is probably one of the bigger ones. And draws per week, how much you scrape, your environment, your climate, all have an effect on how your ice is changing and how quickly or slowly it changes. So we came up with basically sort of 3 different types of ice maintenance activities. This is basically, our talk is really going to focus on the first 2. So occasional maintenance activities, this is sort of a list we came up with. There might be a few other things that you might add on there for your club. I would just point out 2 things about first aid. One is you want to make sure your equipment's up to date, and wherever people are honing that blade or doing anything on a blade, you want to make sure that you have first aid equipment there handy. I don't know if people are familiar, but there are these bandages that are called quick clotting bandages that you can get, that actually, if somebody did happen to cut themselves, it's like a gauze bandage, but it'll help clot up the blood a little bit quicker. I found mine at REI, the sporting goods store, but I'm sure you can find them in other places. And anti-cut gloves or Kevlar gloves you can find at where they sell butcher supply stuff. A lot of people don't like using gloves when they're honing blades or feeling around the blades, but it's good practice to, when you're just, you should have them available for people to use if they'd like to. These are some of the things we came up with on a daily list for daily ice maintenance activities. So one of the things I'll mention at the top, as you're preparing for a scrape, one of the recommendations, like under WCF CIE, was that to raise the ice temperature, they identified 24.8. It's really a question of raising it a little bit higher than what you'd normally have. It's something that, as we talked about for this training, it's probably something that most clubs don't do or can't do, okay? That you may not be in a position to be able to get your ice temperature back down to where you want to have it at your playing temperature, depending on when you scrape, or it may be a manual activity that's not really worth doing, but it's just one of those things that shows up in various recommendations for when you're going to start to scrape. So the other thing I wanted to touch upon is generally, it's going to vary from club to club, whether you pebble all your sheets before you scrape or not. It's kind of up to you. Greg or Ian, you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. I personally do not pebble the sheets very often before a scrape. There's normally enough pebble on there that you can work with. Scraping the ice, you want to take it down to the ice and not touch the ice. But if you keep putting pebble on it, it's harder to get down to the ice. If you don't have a whole lot of curling and you feel you need to level some stuff up, absolutely, pebble and scrape. But for the most part, it's not really necessary.
Greg?
Yeah, I'll kind of agree with Ian on that. I rarely ever pebble before I scrape. Often what I'll do is I'll go in, I'll scrape first, and then I'll pebble, and then I'll scrape again. And by doing that, if you can do that on a somewhat regular basis throughout your week, once or twice a week, you scrape, then you pebble, then you scrape, and maybe you pebble again and then scrape. If you have time, the more you do that, over the long run, you'll be able to keep your ice flatter and more level and cleaner. The more you do that, every time you throw that pebble down, it's picking up a lot of the dirt that gets, on the surface of the ice, and then you scrape that up. And same thing, you're pebbling and then scraping, you're filling in those low spots and cutting them, even with the highs. But again, I typically but when I come in the morning, if it's already been pebbled, I won't pebble on top of it before I scrape. I generally scrape first and then would do a second pebble on a scrape.
So
Sorry, what was that question that popped up there in the chat, Russell?
I'll take a look. So Greg, how frequently do you hone your blade?
It depends on which blade I have on there. I have a couple different types of blades that I work with. Currently, I have two of the Canada curling stone blades, which I find I don't have to hone that often. Obviously, with more use, you should be honing it. And again, you just kind of get a sense of whether it's cutting the ice or cutting the pebble off the pipe in a nice shave, or if it's really just kind of crushing the pebble and ripping it off. A couple signs that it's doing that, if your blade isn't very sharp, you'll notice that the snow kind of sprays up rather than cuts and rolls along the blade. And then the other thing you'll start to notice is you'll get a little bit of snow underfoot after you've done a pass down the sheet, which means that your blade's probably getting a little duller and you should be honing it. So those are a couple signs you should look out for, to hone it. But it never hurts to throw the honing stone on it, once every couple days or scrapes that you do. I think doing it on a regular basis, helps keep it sharper in the long run, and cleaner.
Anything you want to add to that, Ian?
No, Greg pretty well filled everything in there. I have to agree with all of what he said. Some blades you have to work on a little more than others, and some blades you really don't want to work on because you keep changing them. But if you hone a blade and it doesn't change too much, you could probably hone it every couple of days or every day if you want, as long as it doesn't change it. But if it starts changing quickly, I'd leave it alone.
So couple questions popped up. One is there a problem with honing the blade every day?
No, I don't think so. If the more you hone the blade, I think the quicker over the long run, you'll end up needing to kind of replace it more quickly, I think. Probably what happens is the more you hone it, the thinner and thinner and thinner that cutting edge gets, to a point where it just becomes so soft that every time you use it to cut, it's going to roll down on you. So over honing a blade is probably not a great idea, but every couple of days is not too bad. And like I said, it really depends on the use in the blade. Every blade's a little bit different. And again, this is why, when you have one person who's doing everything every day throughout the week, it's a lot easier to pick up on these things than if you have a number of different people doing it. It's, they're not seeing the same thing day in and day out. So, communicate. Again, if I go scrape today and I know I'm not going to be here for the next 2 days, I'll let my assistant Scott know. I think the blade needs a little honing. It was starting to get a little, I got a little chafe under the blade. I could feel the snow underfoot. So, communicate these things with the next people who are coming in.
So it also would depend on what grit you were using, right? You could take a really fine grit and just touch it, right, every day possibly.
Yeah.
And see how that works out for you over a period of time, as long as you're not trying to do anything too challenging. Or if you're already using a kind of rough grit, then that might be a different story as to if you do it every day, it might be a little too much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and maybe get a couple different, grades of honing stone, or, as Hans had recommended in the last meeting, you can do it with a flat stone and some sandpaper, like a nice carbon silicide sandpaper. And you can get a couple different grits to that. I think he recommended 400 for the more aggressive honing, and then like 1,000 for a more gentle honing. So
Yeah, that was correct. So Hillary has a question, which basically is our blade was starting to dull and hone. He didn't seem to correct it. Could we hone it more aggressively? They
I'm
just
sorry,
said-
what was that?
So she says our blade was starting to dull and honing it did not seem to correct that. Could we hone it more aggressively?
Yeah, you could certainly try, get a little more aggressive grit, and then try at that, squeeze nice and tight on the blade as you do it, put a little more pressure on it as you hone it and see how it works.
So going back, so there was a question about how do you pebble down to the ice without touching the ice? So Ian, when you were talking about, you were scraping your pebble down to the ice, but without getting down to, I think what you meant by the actual flat pad.
The base, we call it. Yeah.
Yeah. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, if you touch the ice, 9 times out of 10, you're not level or your blade's out. And when you do touch the ice, you'll see a scar mark on your ice. As soon as you see that scar mark, as Greg said earlier, you can fix it by scraping your ice first and then pebbling, scraping that out. But if you have scar marks and don't look after it, they're going to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And time to flood.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think what Ian was getting at is, when we kind of make our ice and we get our ice ready at the beginning of the season, we have kind of what we call the base. We have our base level, and that's our base playing surface that we start with. And then we put a pebble on top of that. And then when we're done with the idea is you want to just scrape the pebble off. You don't want to dig too deep and get down into that base. You don't want to cut into your base ice. If you're cutting that deep, you're going to run out of ice. You're going to end up cutting down to your yard and stuff like that. And B, you're never really going to know if it's level or not. And you'll be able to tell if you're cutting into your base because it almost looks like it's sort of smeared. And as Ian said, you'll see cut marks in it. It'll look a little like you cut too deep. I think it's a little more noticeable. What you really want to do is when you're cutting the pebble off, you really just want to cut down to the very, I call it like the shadow of the pebble. You can very barely see the faint residual shadow of the pebble that you just put down when you shave it properly. And yeah, over time that, if you're not cutting all of it off, it's going to start to build up on you. And that's when we go back and we do a little pebble scrape to fill in those low spots. But you want to cut down just barely to the base, before you get to the base of your ice.
So going down to the next page. So when we're talking about sort of daily ice maintenance activities, part of it is kind of having a plan for what you're doing. And so these are some of the things that we think that are important to think about while you're putting together your plan for a day. You only have whatever much time you have. So you're going to have to make sure that you're getting done what you can get done. Things that you can't get done that maybe do need to be addressed, you have to put on your list for other people to pick up at some point in time. So to me, kind of when I think about it, the first thing that you're kind of assessing is the area of play. These are the items that seem to appear in the area of play. Then there's kind of assessing the ice surface. To me, that could be reading the ice and includes while you're playing, watching play, listening to others who have played. And then there's reading the scraper blade, which is a different piece of business. So for me, when I'm reading the ice and I'm playing with other people, I want to know there's certain people I have a good sense for, that we have a common understanding of the ice. And a lot of times when I'm playing regular games or in pickup, I'm chatting with the other skip all the time about what do they think about the ice? What's it doing here? What's it doing there? So in some cases, that's one way to read the ice. Watching play is a different way. There's some pros and cons to that. Listening to others, there's lots of pros and cons to those things. Ian, Greg, you have any thoughts about any of those three things? Playing, watching, or listening?
You do have to watch. You do have to listen. You got to be careful who you're watching and who you're listening to. We try to listen to some of the better curlers that throw a better rock. And when they lose, certain people will complain, even though they are one of the better curlers. So you have to take that take a grain of salt into that. Anyway, you just got to figure out your membership and watch the better curlers throw and listen to people you think you need to listen to.
Yeah, I agree. I think one of the most important skills you can develop as an ice maker is your observational skills, whether it's what you observe while you're out there working on the ice, the things you see while you're scraping or while you're pebbling, but also, observing people play out in the ice, either when you're throwing stones yourself or, when you're watching from behind the glass. It's tough to watch behind the glass because you don't always get a good view of where people are actually throwing the stone. You can't assume where the broom was put is where they actually threw it. So sometimes you got to kind of get out there and walk along the backboards when people are playing, and hopefully they won't mind you too much, and you sort of stand behind where the skip is and you look at the broom they put down, and then you watch them throw the stone and see where they actually threw the stone. But you have to be a very keen observer as an ice person to kind of pick up on the things that are going on out there. And again, that just comes down to being able to spend a lot of time at the club, whether you're working on the ice or watching the ice.
So the other thing that popped up as part of one of the questions was reading the ice. And I know that people talk occasionally about reading the scraper blade. It's not a skill that I've ever really acquired, but maybe you and Ian could just chat about that and what you look for and how you go about that.
Sure. Yeah, I actually just did it today. It's always nice if you can get a shift or two during, once a week or twice a week where you have two people in there working. You have one person who's driving the scraper, and I generally will do this on my street 3-pass when I have a straight blade going. I'll set the blade nice and straight. We'll do a 3-pass up the center and then down each side. And you have one person who's driving and one person who's kind of walking backwards, watching that blade. You take a broom with you and you just sort of watch how the snow builds up on the blade, and you'll start to see areas where, it's either really thick in the middle or maybe it's tapered at the end, or I got one spot where it's not cutting at all. So you sort of walk down each lane, I'll walk down the center, wipe the blade off every couple feet or so, just to see how the blade's cutting. And that'll give you, as long as if you trust that blade is even and straight, it will give you a good sense of how your ice is looking. If you know your blade is level and straight and you're starting to see variations along the length of the blade and how thick that ice is rolling up there, or the snow is rolling up there, then you have some unevenness in your ice and you need to start addressing those spots.
I agree, Greg, 100%. Another way you could do it is, as Greg says, if you went in and scraped first, pebble and scrape again, when you're scraping that for the second time after you pebble it, you can take half that pebble off and get somebody in front of that blade and swipe the snow off and see if there's any low spots. They'll show up. They'll leave the pebble if you have low spots.
So one of the things, Greg, I noticed when I was in Mayfield with Sean Olson was he was pulling the snow off the blade quite often as they went down the sheet, which led me to believe that he really wanted to see if there were any changes as he was going down the sheet, that he'd had a good idea how it was cutting at, at the first hog line and then halfway and then at the end hog line. And I think
that's exactly what he's doing. They're checking to make sure draw to draw. And you got to look at these guys. I mean, they're in there making the ice for just a week's use, but they're checking it every single time they scrape it just to make sure that it's going to stay level. And also, they know that it does get uneven fairly quickly if they don't stay on top of it. So.
All right, let's move on. So this is sort of a recommended way through the WCF and Curling Ice Explained, a way you can throw stones. You really want to have a good stone thrower to be able to do that. Let's see.
Hey, Russell, before we move on to this one, do you mind just, it looks like Chris had a question.
Yeah, go right ahead, Greg. If you saw the questions, just speak right up. I'm having trouble managing
Chris
both of them.
A question from Triangles is, when you do find low spots, how to best address them. Do you pebble scrape the whole sheet over and over, or add extra pebble over the low spot? You know, I think that's sort of a situational thing. If it's on the outside edges, I tend to, we'll just sort of pebble, you know, throw a little extra pebble on the outside edges. If it's in the middle, then you know, usually that's indicating that there's a high spot somewhere. So I'll kind of change my patterns and do a few extra passes over the middle to scrape down those high spots. And then maybe just do like a full sheet pebble and scrape. So it really kind of depends on where you see it. And what exactly you're seeing. So it might not just be a low spot. It could be a high spot where you're getting compacted ice, like along your 4 foot or your 8 foot lines where all the play happens. So.
And then when we get a little farther in, I've got a photo of an interesting pebble head that somebody uses to deal with kind of low spots along the wall sheets. So,
yeah.
And so then
Yeah.
this is a different way for like assessing your ice surface, throwing stones. This is from the SIG, you know, and they're just talking about, this is a way to kind of get a sense of, is your center line rising? If you throw stones with a stick, you could use this on your inside sheets to determine whether your outside edges are rising. You could do the same thing on your sidelines, which I'm actually, I was out visiting people at Utica, and that was one of the things they find with their ice, that their sidelines creep up a little bit. And so they sort of keep track of it. So let's just move on here, unless there's any other questions. And if you can watch the chat, Greg, that'd be great.
Yeah.
So weekly maintenance activities. Some clubs may have some other things that they would add to this. One of the questions that came up by one of the people that signed up was, how frequently do you hot map your hacks or around your hacks? So, and to me, it seemed like we were trying to do that on a weekly basis. We weren't actually hot mopping around the ice. We were kind of steaming it actually, because hot mopping wasn't very easy where we were. Our water was down a half a flight of stairs from the ice sheet, and it was a bit of a pain to do. So, and then after that, we had somebody that would hand scrape them once a week. So
So Hillary here is asking, she doesn't know what hot mopping is. So for anyone who doesn't know, hot mopping is when you have areas on your ice that are a little bit dirty, generally around the garages or the hacks. You take a towel or a mop with some hot deionized water, and you just sort of, you dunk it in the bucket, wring it out, and then you use that kind of steam heat from the mop, and should kind of clean and pull all the dirt up that's kind of been ground in around the area there.
And in a lot of clubs, if you aren't able to scrape behind the hacks, if you don't have removable hacks, then what would happen is that area would kind of possibly where the rocks sit, the rock boxes are in the garages, get all frosty and keep growing up, and stuff would stick on the ice around the hacks. And so hot mopping was a way to kind of clean up those areas on a regular basis. So,
and I'd have to say, if you're, I mean, I scrape my garages and my hacks pretty much every day. I move my stones out, scrape that area, and that helps keep the dirt down pretty good, because it'll build up on you quickly if you got multiple draws, or if you're not cleaning them or scraping the areas every day. Then dirt gets ground in, then you pebble it in, it gets sealed in, and then you keep building up on that, and you get to a point where hot mopping, you're gonna have to hot mop for an hour to get it up. So the more frequently you can actually scrape around your garage areas and your hacks, the easier it is to keep them clean.
I agree, Greg, 100%. It's not just easier, it's better. I do have removable hacks, and I have them out every day, and I do under the rocks every day. And I don't hot mop. I haven't hot mopped in 20 years.
Yeah.
I had a hot mop when you can't take the hacks out. You got a hot mop then, but hot mopping also makes your ice unlevel. So when you're scraping it, you don't get as clean. It's easier and better to do it every day.
Yeah, and the key is, if you do hot mop, you got to make sure that when you're done hot mopping, that you're pebbling and scraping that area just to flatten it out again too. So
yeah, try to, yeah.
And so Ian, can you talk a little bit about your once a week scrape?
My once a week scrape, I scrape it pretty hard once a week. I also burn around the hacks once a week, add a little bit of water while I'm burning the hacks with a big torch. I do that religiously every week. And I scrape it very hard once a week.
And you had mentioned that you actually have a blade that you put on for that heavy scrape
I
versus the
have
one you're using.
a blade
every
on the
day.
side that's nice and fresh, and you're able to get right down to the ice.
And so in general, sort of like that, this is listed as one of the weekly things that the OCA has in their list of, you know, heavy scrape, garage, rocks boxes, pebble, and then scrape again. So it's something you want to just think about depending on what you're doing in your club and how your ice is performing, but it may be a way to help get some of that built up pebble off the ice once a week so that it's not accumulating.
And then you can do like Greg does, pebble at it. After you do that real heavy scrape, you can pebble it again and take half that pebble off. And your ice is going to be really good.
Yeah. Ian, a question came up, says, what do you mean by a very hard scrape or heavy scrape? What's different between that and doing a regular scrape? Is it just more passes? Is it you're dialing the blade down deeper?
I'm going down deeper and more passes.
Okay.
And again, you don't want to touch the ice or scar the ice. And if you ever scar the ice, you'll see it when you're doing a heavy scrape. It's not hard to see.
Yeah, it looks like you've almost smeared it.
Yeah.
I have to say that
And you probably feel the scraper move left or right.
Mm-hmm.
so I hadn't really seen that on Greg and Ian until I spent a week with Sean.
Mm-hmm.
And once we were flooding and scraping and pebbling and flooding to get ready for this event, but we got to a certain point where he called me down and said, and we were down by one of the houses and you could look and see where you could just see these areas that seemed a little bit shadowy, okay, where there wasn't pebble, all right? Everywhere else, the pebble had been scraped pretty flat, but not all the way down to the pad.
Mm-hmm.
And these shadow areas were really what were the pad, okay?
Yeah.
And I would say, the pad parts were 10 or 15% of the area. I don't know, Greg, how to gauge, but it wasn't a lot, okay? And so you felt like, okay, now I'm down to a really good space, and every draw, that's where we were trying to get down to.
Yeah.
So to me, it's something that I wish I had a really good photo of to share with people. It's something that when you see it, you'll know it and you'll remember it. But I have to say that it wasn't, I didn't feel like when I was at Broomstones, we were getting down there on a regular basis, but we were just people trying to do it once a week. Okay. Or, we didn't really have a regular once a week pattern. And it was just every day, which was a bit of a challenge to think that you were going to get there.
Yeah, and if I were doing like, I typically come in the mornings, and that's when I'll do a little extra work, and rather than just doing a single set of passes, maybe I'll do 2 sets of passes, and then I'll do a pebble and scrape, and that's how I would kind of do like a heavy maintenance type thing. It's just doing extra passes, really trying to get any extra pebble off there, and then maybe pebbling and scraping again to help clean it up and flatten it out.
You can't overscrape. Not hard. You can't overscrape. If you do that once a week, you're fine. But you do it every second day,
Yeah.
you're going to be overscraping, and your ice will straighten up in a heartbeat. You can have fresh rocks and have straight ice if you overscrape it.
Yeah, exactly. You don't just want to keep scraping and scraping and scraping. Like you said, if you go in there, you do a couple, like 2 sets of passes, then you throw down a pebble and then scrape again. Like I said, you just don't ever want to get into your base.
So let's move on. So there was a question about pebbling, and it basically was regarding timings around up and down the sheet and swings or whips or whatever you want to call them. So we'll spend a few minutes on a couple different things about this. So I think the main point to get across is it's really time, the amount of time and the amount of swings is really going to vary by a number of different things. And so when we're talking about this, in general, I think people think the ideal is about a 40-second pass, which would be for a game pebble, okay? And that really is going to depend on what type of pebble head you're using. At the same time, I think the recommendation is around 80 swings, okay? And I have to say, I came across this video today, Pebbling Fundamentals. It's on YouTube. It's by Frank McGavero from Charlotte. And at the tail end of it, I mean, he's got a nice video of pebbling, and I would encourage people to find that and look at it. I think it's a pretty good example as a place to start, okay? So what you're really looking for a game pebble is somewhat about 6 to 8 per square inch. Other people will talk about it in terms of how many per square meter, okay? It's really important to alternate your starting points, not just home and away, but sheets. Start on sheet 1, start on sheet 2, start on sheet 1, start on sheet 4. And you want to keep a log talking about where people start, so people won't all be starting in the same place, following the same path. So this to me is just speaks a lot about how much variation there is in pebble heads and how much water you're putting on depending on what you use. And so you want to be cautious or knowledgeable about that when you're thinking about what your pace is. If you're going to use a compression dome 65 hole, you are going to have you're going to have to go a lot faster than a 40-second pace, or you're going to be like flooding the ice. And the key about your arm swings basically are they got to be coordinated with your pace. All right. So if you're using 80 swings a minute for a 40-second pace, and all of a sudden you speed up your pace, you're going to have to speed up your arm swings. Or if you slow down your pace, you're going to slow down your arm swings. Otherwise, you're going to be laying too much down on the ice. And so the Curling Ice Explains talks about 17 to 18 arm swings every 10 seconds. So if you've got a 40-second sheet, that'd be close to 80 arm swings. So, and counting arm swings is not one of the easier things to do. You can watch when Frank does his and count his, and he looks like he's just above 80. And then here's some other things about pebbling. You know, moving too quickly is too few, going too slow is too many. And occasionally it helps to, you know, at the beginning of the season when you're flooding, that's a really good time to pebble and see what you're getting for your distribution. Same thing at the end of the season, it's a good time to play around with scraping and pebbling. Last year at the end of the season when Grace was closing up his shot, we spent some time down there with some green dye and a pebble can, seeing what we were getting for distribution. We're using some different heads to see what it looked like. And to me, it was quite easy to see how quickly we could scrape it off and start again and take a look again. So there's different ways to kind of do some practicing with that. And so you can get a better sense of just what type of distribution are you getting.
Yeah, and Jeff just brought up a good point and says, you know, if you can get people out there to train them before the ice is even in, that's even better. If you have a nice concrete floor, you know, use it during the summer or the spring before you put the ice in. That's a great way. You can lay a couple strings down that show you exactly how wide your sheets are, and then you just sort of pebble down those, and it shows up great on the concrete. It shows you how far you're throwing it, what your distribution is, and then you're also not, you know, getting your ice out of whack by pebbling the ice all the time. So if you have a concrete floor, get people out there before you start putting the ice in and use that concrete floor to your advantage.
So, and two other things I'd mention about that is, one, in helping people get to the right pace, it's important to use a stopwatch. And that Donnie Powell from Toronto had shared with me that one of the ways he was training his people is he would have new people walk next to him when he was pebbling. And so that they would start to get a good sense of what the pace was. And what you can do with new people is actually provide them with a pace person. So all that they have to worry about is walking backwards. And if they stay next to you and you're at the right pace, they'll start to develop that pace. It's a way for them to learn. I also think that taking videos of people, you know, if you're making a video or use somebody's cell phone to take a video of them when they're pebbling, then they can go home and look at it and start to get a sense of what it looks like for them.
Yeah.
Anything you'd add, Ian?
Yeah, I agree with all the stuff you did. I love the video thing. When I'm trying to straighten up my guys, I get them to video me and I'll start dumping on the left. And then I'll say, oh my God, look, I'm dumping. That's not right. Let's try it again. I'll stop dumping. So I'll do it properly and video myself again. I said, okay, geez, thank God we're doing a video. Let's try you now.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And don't just assume that because someone pebbles that they know what they're doing, or that they might be really good at it, but they might have these little idiosyncrasies that are, like maybe they throw further to the right than the left. And if no one sees that and points it out to them, then they're not going to make the adjustment that they need to do. So you should, I regularly have my assistant and I, we regularly kind of watch each other pebble and we assess ourselves, every couple of weeks we're doing it, just to make sure that we're still doing the right thing. And even though we're doing it every day, it doesn't mean we're doing it all right all the time. So you got to keep an eye on it. A couple ways you can do that is you can kind of have have someone stand on the sideline and put their foot there, and you can see how far up their foot you're pebbling. I like to you can get like a little piece of blackboard that's maybe a foot long by a foot wide. You can lay that down on the sheet next to it and you sort of pebble along, and you can see how many pebbles go over the sideline and how far they're pebbling out. So you're looking at how far are they throwing it? Also, the other things to look for are how even are they throwing it? Is it really flying up to this side and staying low on the left side? You want a nice even level pebble coming out all the time. So there's lots of things to look for, but you should be doing it on a regular basis. You can't just look at someone and say, oh, they pebbled right this time, and assume they're doing it right all the time.
This just happened to me a few weeks ago. I have a guy that's with me now for the last 10 years. He's very good, like very good at what he does. But he was getting lazy. And then we had a shutdown on COVID, and we're fooling around with the ice. He was getting lazy. He just wasn't getting it out there. I always like to keep the dividers a hair high, not too high, but a hair high. And I take them down once a week. Anyway, I let him keep pebbling. So he probably did 20 draws one week. I never said a thing to him until maintenance day. I said, okay, let's go scrape. He goes, regular scrape? I said, sure. Let's go have a look and see what the dividers are like. I knew they'd be low. They were low by probably 8 or 9 inches, right down the dividing line. I said, what's going on here? And he says, that looks like it's low. And I said, why would it be low? Because I'm not getting out there. I said, let's get out there next week. So we just did a different pattern that day, and then he corrected himself. So you can tell on the dividers if you're not getting out there very quickly. It'll only take a few days.
So the only other thing I'd add is I was at a club a couple of weeks ago where they were talking about not everybody's doing the same pace. And I was like, well, here's a couple of ways you can get to that. And the problem was they had somebody that pebbled for them that they thought did a good job that wasn't quite being able to do 40 seconds. They could do 50 seconds. And so what they did was they had got that person a pebble head that had less holes in it. So going slower worked out for and kind of matched up in a distribution compared to what everybody else was doing. So that's another way to kind of adjust. And pebbling is one of the more important things we do. It's one of the harder things that we do. And it's probably one of the things that we could spend more time on that we find that was really helpful. So let's see, scraping patterns. So there was a question about angle in, angle out, but just to back up a bit. So everybody's got their favorite patterns. The patterns I put in here, since some of you have access to Curling Ice Explained, some don't. And I had sent out the article by the SIG on cutting techniques. So I just wanted to make sure that in this presentation, you can see the slides that CIE recommends. So Chris had a question about angle in, angle out, all the way, part way, how far? What do you think, Greg? What do you think, Ian?
You change it up. It doesn't have to be the same all the time. You can angle it halfway, you can angle it all the way out. What we're trying to do is by angling the blade is just changing the way the blade cuts in each spot as it goes down the ice so that we're not always cutting the same way. If you always go with the straight blade, you're going to end up kind of, there's always going to be a little bit of resonance in that blade as it cuts down the ice. And if you're always doing it the same way, you're going to start to develop ripples or ridges if the blade is always at the same angle. So by turning the blade a little bit, you're just changing the angle that it's going over each spot of the ice and preventing that, we call it chatter. And you would feel it as you go down the ice. You'll feel the blade kind of shake a little bit, and you'll see almost like a corduroy effect if you're always cutting at the same angle. So it doesn't matter if you turn it all, 45 degrees or 30 degrees or whatever, as long as you're changing the angle, every time you scrape, that's the important part.
You definitely want to make sure that people are in your group are kind of being consistent about what they do.
Mhm.
I noticed when I was in Mayfield with Sean that he definitely didn't crank it all the way. It was
Mhm.
half maybe we went for pretty regularly. I think he was a little bit concerned that maybe there was a little tilt to the blade when you were all the way in and you raised it up and maybe you're going to nip the surface at some point in time. But basically, a lot of this is just trying to make sure that you kind of vary the patterns. Some clubs actually have a system that they do this on Monday, they do this on Tuesday, they do this on Wednesday, they do this on Thursday, and people follow that, and it's sort of a protocol. And so other people basically vary it every day. It's important to keep a log, okay? You want to have an understanding of what somebody did yesterday, and so that you're not kind of doing the same thing over and over again. So these are these scraping patterns, and I'm not going to spend any time on them. They're different. There's tons of scraping patterns out there that people use, okay? Some of these I don't think are being used by many people other than the 7-pass. So these are some things to keep in mind. This stuff comes from the OCA manual. You can dig it out on your own if you want. And then these are sort of the things that we found where we believe are sort of common ice problems that most clubs face in some way, shape, or form. Here's this pebble head that I came across in Rochester. I was out visiting Bob Williams and we were chatting and he had this pebble head at his Pebble station. And I was like, what is that for? And so he uses that when he's got sublimation along the outside walls. It maybe comes in off the sideboards a foot or 18 inches. And he walks down the ice backwards like he's pebbling normally and right along the edge of the boards, and he uses this pebble head, and it seems to work fairly good for him. So there are some innovative ways to deal with some of this stuff. I'm not sure what type of head it is. It sort of looks like it's a traditional beaver tail from Canada curling stone, but this is what they're using to help themselves out.
Yeah.
So part of the challenge that we all face here is how do you kind of fix problems? And so we wanted to talk a little bit about that. And it's important that, once you can identify what the problem is, that you can experiment using whatever recommended practice we have to see if you can fix that. There's a lot of talk in different places about being willing to experiment and try to experiment. And it's just important to understand that if you're going to experiment, you can only be changing one of the variables at a time. So if you want to start changing, how you pebble and you're going to change your water temperature, you got to make sure that you're not changing your air temperature, humidity, or anything else, okay? If you want to change your scrape pattern, that's fine. You don't want to be changing your pebbling patterns at the same time you're changing your scrape patterns. So you just want to think through as you're going forward and trying experiments that you don't want to be doing more than one thing at a time. Otherwise, you won't know what really affected the change if you get a change. So keep notes. It really helps so you can go back and see what you did. And then there's this question of preventing what you're doing, preventing a situation or mitigating a situation. So this is an example that came up in one of my meetings with one of the clubs. You can apply this to numerous other situations. You got to sort of pick and choose what's feasible to fix and what isn't, and are you going to be left mitigating something? Any ideas or thoughts you got, Greg or Ian, about problem solving?
One thing at a time.
Yeah, exactly. And you're always doing it, it's, ice is always changing. And the more you use it and the less you maintain it, the quicker it's going to change on you. So that's my thing is the more you can get in there and scrape and pebble and scrape in between each draw if you can, the longer it's going to stay even. But even then, it's over time, it's just going to get out of whack, and then you flood.
I think it is helpful to know how your ice changes over time, and that's where I think keeping a log can be really helpful.
Yeah.
I think we were talking the other day about this, and Ian pointed out that, you know, you really don't want to get to the point where you've got a problem when you're flooding. You want to make sure that you're flooding just before you get to that point. So, or before you do a controlled melt or whatever you're doing. So let's see. Couple things we wanted to talk about was, we thought keeping the ice clean was an important thing to chat about a little bit about. It's one of the things that tends to get lost in all of this. So the one thing that I would just note here is, it's important that the ice tech rooms, okay, are clean and neat. All right, the floors look clean. Okay, all right. It's one of those areas where it's just trying to be a role model. Okay, that I've been in a couple different clubs, and some they do and some they don't. And it's just, to me, it's a key thing that speaks to how the ice technicians see anything. I think you'll be in a better position to talk to other people in your club and players and other people about what they're doing or not doing if you're keeping your space clean and everything's neat. So somebody had asked about sticky mats and whether they're valuable and worth the cost. I can't tell you whether they're worth the cost. You know, 5 years ago, we started using them at Broomstones, and we were having them at each door. And I think we were basically getting 3 to 4 days on them. Okay. And I think we found that they were kind of worthwhile. You know, for those of you who've been to Broomstones, you know that you kind of come right in the front door, and then people can either walk up to the warm room or go down to the locker room. And that's basically the entrance to sheet 4 for anybody that's up in the warm room. This sticky mat was on sheet 1. This is one draw, you know, people in and out, plus a few of the ice guys going in and out on this. So this is what we picked up at when they had the Kaiser. This was on a Friday when it had been raining outside, a little bit wet, but it had been some ice on the walkways outside. So the walkways had been sanded a little bit. And so I think that people were tracking in a little bit of the sand from the walkways and coming in the front door, wiping their feet, walking across the carpet, and then heading down to the locker room. So the sticky mats from sheet 4 looked a little dirtier than these. And I think that these were a little dirtier than maybe what would be normal, just because of the sand that people were probably tracking in on their shoes. All right. Now,
Yeah, I recommend using them. Someone did ask that question, is how important are they to have? I think they're great to have. A, it helps keep that dirt off the ice. You can see how much would otherwise get out on the ice. And B, you can use it as a learning moment for your curlers and be like, oh, you think your shoes are clean, huh? And as they step on the sticky mat, they see how they really aren't. And maybe they should get in the habit of, you know, washing their grippers off once a week or something like that. So
one of the things you find in some Canadian clubs, and Ian could speak to this, is people take their shoes off at the front door.
Yeah, there's a lot of clubs. It started probably 10 years ago. There's a lot of clubs now that you literally take your shoes off, and some people have slippers, some people don't. And as far as that sticky mat goes, I've been making ice a long time. I think I'm 39 years this year. And that thing there is the best thing since sliced bread. So we're fairly busy up here. We have 36 to 40 draws a week. So you're getting 5 or 6 draws out there a day. And to try to keep up with all that dirt, it was very difficult. And then they come up to sticky matter, whenever it was, 10 years ago. It's night and day how clean the ice is with it.
And someone pointed out in the chat that you can get some brown paper that can help with the wet areas when you're wet. I'm not familiar about that, but so a couple things about keeping the ice clean. You know, you want to look at the ice and see what it tells you about. I've, you know, years ago tested snow from a first scrape to see what the snow might pick up. You can do the same thing if you nip the ice after a draw versus mopping it. Okay, that the nipper is going to pick up anything that is laying on that top pebble, and it'll, if you melt it, you can look at it and see what kind of debris are in there. You can test it for TDS and It'll help you get a little bit better understanding of how much junk is on your ice if you haven't done that. Anything you would say about that, Greg? Ian?
The TDS stuff, there's not many ice makers use it, but it's a very helpful tool. If you take your snow just from your ends and just take a beer glass, fill her up, melt it down, take the TDS. You'll find it's quite high. Then you do the same, scrape your sheets. If you keep that under 100, you're in pretty good shape. You get over 100, you're in trouble.
So I want to go back a little bit to a couple things, some questions that I've got written down here that people had. So one of the questions that came in is how do we choose scraping patterns? This club has 3 different ones and they just rotate them. And I guess the real question is, well, what are you getting for an outcome of the 3 you're using? Is that working for you? Is it giving you good ice? You know, if it's not, then the question is why, or what do you think the problems are?
Yeah.
Yeah, my point was we just do the same thing over and over and over, and it makes our head volunteer ice maker happy, but are we really doing the right thing? And how do I know?
What are you doing?
We've got a 10 pass
Okay.
with an angle blade, 2-hole outside, and then with a straight blade, center, outside, center, 12-foot. The 6 pass is the same as those last 6, straight blade, center, outside, center, 12-foot. And then we've got a variation of one Sean gave us. It's a 3-hole, 1-hole, outside.
How's your ice?
Angle blade.
Yeah, is it
It's
working?
pretty good. It's pretty good. Could it be better? I wish I knew.
Well,
Been
if
with
it-
the ice for a long time. I've been playing for a long time, but I'm still not sure what I'm looking at.
so I mean, so one approach is to say, if what you've got is pretty good, all right, then you could experiment to see if you can get a little bit better, all right? You might try it after a flood and when you know you've got sort of you're flat and level and you're ready to go. And then the question is, what do you change to? You know, so to me, I thought, you know, when I was out there with you guys in September,
Mhm.
that, you know, it was pretty clear that, boy, if you could get Sean back for a day, boy, would that help you out, okay? All right, for any club, okay? I mean, so from that perspective. So it might be worth having a chat with him to see if you could figure out how to do that. I think he knows your ice, right? He knows your club. He knows the situation about your airflow and everything. So that for you guys could be a real benefit, I think. To use him. I mean, it might be a Zoom consultation, you know, once the season's over. But that would be one way to kind of get a gander of what you're doing and what you might be able to do to try something different. To me, the beauty of it at the moment is that you've got something that's pretty good. So you ought to be able to get back to that if you do try something. All right. You know, if you weren't sure where you were at right at the moment and you start trying a bunch of different stuff, that's a whole different story.
The ice doesn't have to be perfect. We still should have to read the ice and read the throw.
Not all of us feel that way.
Well,
No, I think
do
it's
you
a
walk
good point.
on, do you walk on a perfect green every day? You walk on the golf course?
Yeah, and you do. You have to be realistic. I mean, even when you watch things like the Olympics or the Scotties, you know, that sheet of ice is changing throughout the game, right? And those guys, the people that pick it up are the ones that win. They say, oh, you know, this line's getting straighter, or this line's faster. That's going to change, you know, even over the course of a game. So
Yeah. I've
No,
seen
that's-
green ice change 12 feet in speed within 2 minutes.
Mhm.
It's like, holy shit.
But getting back to, I think that comment of your scrape patterns and stuff like that, it's okay to have a base set of patterns. For me, I generally work with, I do a 3-pass, and then, the next time I do my set, I do a 4-pass, and then the next time I do a 3-pass, then the next time I do a 6-pass, and that's my general rotation is 3, 4, 3, 6, 3, 4, 3, 6. And I'm changing the directions that I turn each time. I'm changing the blade angles, and the overlaps that I do. And then, over time, as I start to see things appear, like if I start getting a high spot down the 8-foot line or, between the 8-foot and the 12, then I'll do a couple extra passes along there just to kind of help keep those down. So, and then, the other thing you have to take into consideration is how often are you playing on the ice? How many times are you pebbling that ice between each scrape? For me, where I'm at, I get the luxury of scraping almost every single draw. So I'm able to just do a 3-pass and it's nice and clean and ready to set up for the next game, or the 4-pass or whatever. And then, if you're pebbling 3 or 4 times in between each scrape, well, then you're going to have to do more passes to get yourself back down to your base, or you're going to have to dial your blade down a little bit deeper to get back to your base. So, those are things to consider as well. But it's not just always doing the same thing. You have to kind of observe, and when things start to change, you have to kind of adjust what you're doing. And if you start getting high spots, the thing is just get the center of that blade and do a pass down that high spot. Because if it's high, then it should only cut where that high spot is. If you're using the middle of the blade on it, right? If you use the edge of the blade on it, then the blade's going to tilt and you're going to cut the high spot with one edge of the blade, and then you're going to dig a low spot with the other edge of the blade. So when you start seeing those high spots, just center that blade right over that high spot and do a pass, a pass or two until you get it even again, or close to even.
So moving on from that. So one of the questions that came in was, what can we do to improve the amount of curl on our ice? And so that struck me as, the things that at least came to my mind, Ian and Greg, was, well, is your ice flat? Okay. Is it flat and level? If it's not flat and level, then it's really kind of an ice problem, not a stone problem, right? I mean, if you're really going to be kind of trying to assess whether you've got an ice problem or a stone problem, that's the first thing, is to determine whether your ice is flat and level. And if it's not, where isn't it? You can have it be not flat and level in some parts of it, and other parts be fine. And if you're getting 4 feet of curl, you might be fine. The other question that comes up for me is, how much curl do you want? I mean, do you want enough curl so that, you can curl around a guard that's a tight 3 guard? Or do you want to have enough to get to the button if a person's in the 12-foot or the top of the 8-foot? Or are you happy if you got enough curl to get around a 2 guard? Okay. So part of it has to do with what's the expectation in your club for the amount of curl you want to have. Then the question is, are you getting it? Do you have a way to measure that? And if it's not enough, first thing to look at is your ice. If it's not your ice, if your ice is really flat, then it becomes a question of how old are your stones? How good are the running bands? Have you considered texturing them? If you haven't, that might be something you would consider if, in point of fact, your ice is flat and level. Anything else that you guys think about?
Ian?
Ice curls differently for everybody who throws it. You got to be careful. I curled at an event last weekend. The ice was in very good shape. Pebbles in good shape, fairly level, drop back here and there. But I threw my regular throw. It curled about 2 inches. And we had a play on last weekend. By the second or third in, we were making that rock curl 2.5 to 3 feet. their membership, I was watching their membership during the week and was curling 3 to 4 feet because they're used to the straight stuff. So it all depends on your clientele, I think, how much curl you want. I don't make the ice in my clubs. I do not make the ice the way I like it. I tell you that because I would get fired. I would like a lot of curl. And it's pretty hard to have too much curl for myself. So I make a curl 3 feet for me is 4.5 for them. So you just have to figure out your clientele.
It's
Yeah,
rare for,
well, go ahead, continue.
no, go ahead,
Sorry.
Greg. Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I'm just saying things you can play around with to kind of, change how much curl you're getting, things to keep an eye on, or I think first and foremost, as Russell said, is, make sure your ice is nice and flat. When you scrape it down, if it looks like an orange peel, it's kind of bumpy and it's got little pits in it, then it's not very flat. And you don't have a lot of, when you pebble it, you got pebble that's sitting low and you got pebble that's sitting high, and it's not even. So you're not getting your kind of most efficient surface contact with the stone. So it's not going to curl as much. So that's one thing to look at, how flat is your ice? And like I said, if it looks like a lemon peel or an orange peel, then you got to do a little pebbling, scraping, and get it flattened out a little bit. Other things to look at is the temperature of your ice. If your ice is really, really cold, then it's going to be tough for the rough surface of the running man to kind of dig in and grab the ice because it's so hard. So maybe either warm up your surface temperature a little bit or warm up your air a little bit so that the stone can really kind of cut into the ice. It's a little softer and allows it to dig in. Experiment with your pebble size. The larger the pebble size, theoretically, the more surface contact and the more friction it's going to cause and the more it should curl. The more with the nipping as well. If you're not nipping very much and you have a very small surface area at the top of your pebble, then it's not going to create as much surface contact and you're not going to get as much friction. It's not going to curl. It really kind of just comes down to creating that optimal, surface contact for enough friction for it to curl, but not so much friction that it goes crazy or is too slow.
Yeah, no, I'd agree. I'm glad you mentioned nipping because that's one way that you can try to play around with this, take off a little bit more when you nip, and see how that changes things, if it does at all. Now, I was at a club a few weeks ago where they had the opposite problem. Their sides were getting too high and they were getting too much curl out there and they didn't like it. And so now it was sort of, okay, how do you cut down your sidelines so that you can get back to something that's consistent across the whole sheet? Okay, versus lots out in the 12-foot and not enough in comparison when you're in the center of the sheet. So it's something you got to play with. It's certainly something that if your club needs some help or whatever, contact Greg, contact me, and we can figure out how to set up something to have a chat with you. So I just want to go through this last slide for a second to make sure that we.
Russell, sorry, before we move on, John Barbagallo had a comment he wants to ask about rather than type. John, you want to go ahead and unmute yourself?
Hey, Greg, how are you?
Good. How you doing today?
I look forward to seeing you this weekend when I come down for coaching for the U18s.
Excellent. We look forward to you guys coming up.
Yeah, it'll be fun. But I had a question, and it's going to be very difficult for you and or Ian or just about anybody to answer because of the number of variables involved. But if I want to tweak, meaning increase my speed, what set of variables would you start looking at first? Would you look at the surface temp? Would you look at the air temp? I believe I have a fairly level base. Would I start looking at the stones first? Do you have a suggestion as to what I might be able to do to get an extra second or a half a second to a second more speed?
Hey, how old are your rocks?
They are, 9 years old from K.
9 years old from K, so they should be fast. Are
And
you
we last sanded them at Christmas time.
are you scraping down close to your ice?
Yes. Yep.
Are you got DI water?
DI water, but with filters, so I can get my TDS down to between 5 and 10 parts per million.
That's nothing wrong with that.
You guys use a carbon filter as well, John?
That's correct.
Okay.
I would warm your ice up.
What do you have
Yeah,
your temperature at, John?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
Ice surface temperature?
Well, again, I've been experimenting a little bit, as you're suggesting in a lot of these scenarios. Right now, I'm running it between probably about 23.
and
Put it up
what's
to
your air
25 and
temperature
see what
at?
happens.
Yeah, bump it up a little bit is a suggestion.
Yeah, or what's your air temperature, John?
Air temp, I keep a very consistent about 41 degrees.
Try warming your air up a little bit too. You know, it's trying to find that kind of optimal condition of keeping your ice warm enough so that your pebble doesn't go flat, which will slow it down. But also keeping a nice, that kind of barrier right between the air and the ice warm enough that there's enough kind of lubrication going on there. So, you know, maybe bump your air up a couple degrees. You know, for me, I like to try to run my ice a little bit colder and my air a little bit warmer, and that seems to work okay for me for the most part. You know, so yeah, I'd start with that. Start with your temperatures a little bit, and then mess around with your pebble size and your nip as well. Do you drag your rocks after your nip?
For normal league play, we do not. When we have bond spiels, we nip and then run the rocks. And
You
that
notice
does,
the difference?
oh, there is a difference, especially in the first end. But you know, usually it's just a time factor on league play. But again, overall, it's still, you know, just as a reference, I just came back from curling in Utica, and they were the fastest ice I've played on all season. And that's a good second and a half faster than what we have here in Connecticut.
Nice.
So just wondering what we could do.
Yeah, you know, the other thing you can do is, just because you have the DI system set up, you might want to send your water sample, send a sample of water out to your local guy, you know, whoever provides you the DI tanks, and they can test it and see if there's anything in there that the DI tanks or the filters aren't getting. You know, that was one of the things we found when we started using DI, was that, you know, if you're in a location where they're treating your water with ammonia and chlorine, you get these chloramines in the water that don't get stripped out with the DI tanks. And that's why we started using the carbon filters to get those out. So there might be something else in the water that's not getting, you know, pulled out by the filter or the DI tank. So send a sample out and see what they say. You know, maybe get a sample from Utica next time you're out there and compare them and see what some differences are there, if there's anything different about it.
Did you talk to Gary White while you were out there?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Okay,
He and
all
I
right,
got
so
to,
that's fine.
he and I
Good.
got to chat for
Okay.
about 15-20 minutes this weekend.
That's good. No, so for me, I would say, you know, what Greg's saying is true. You know, you can try starting with one or the other, air temperature or ice temperature. You know, you're probably, you'd want to see the speed be consistent through the whole game. So if you're getting it a second or, you know, a couple tenths quicker in the first end, you'd want to make sure that you're getting a couple tenths quicker all the way through. But, you know, I would just, it's sort of try and see what happens. And if you get some changes, I suspect if you thought it was pretty quick at Utica, I'd be continue to use Gary as a consultation to see if you can't get where they are, and using whatever method he's used.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
All right. So there are a couple other questions too that people have. Go
Russell,
ahead.
touch a little more on that. I've never made ice with Greg before, and I agreed 100% with everything he said. And I also agree with warming the air up will help, but be careful on warming it up too much. Not every building can handle the heat, and you'll get more air touching the ice, the warmer the air gets.
Yeah, exactly. You got to be careful with the airflow, that it's not eating into your ice.
So if you warm the ice up first, your heaters will run less. So therefore you'll have less airflow in the bad airflow in the building to a certain point. Both will work. You're probably running too cold.
So a couple other questions that popped up here that we haven't talked about. One was somebody was curious about what's a good recommended floor surface for walkways in your ice shed. And that I think they've tried a couple different approaches, and they're wondering if anybody has any real good solutions to that. I mean, carpet seems pretty popular in some places. Plastic mats are in some places. Some people have wood. I've not run into anything that I would consider recommended for everybody, that everybody's using, but anybody got any hot ideas about that?
Yeah, we've tried a couple different things. Broomstones, we tried a couple different things, from rubber mats to carpets. Whatever is kind of easy to keep clean, that provides good traction, and that isn't going to shed on the ice. A nice tight loop carpet, always works pretty good, as long as you can vacuum it pretty regularly, or you can take it out and shake it out. We tried some kind of rubber mat things a few years ago that had holes in them, but we found that A, they were too slippery for people stepping up with their sliders, and then B, all the dirt would just fall in between, and then static electricity, with the static electricity would just pull it back up and it would end up on the ice. So, and it was tough to clean. You couldn't really get in between those grooves to clean them. So,
Those were technically volleyball mats.
Is that what those were?
Yeah, that's what they were. I looked around at trying to get them. And so, and again, it kind of was, they sit off they were sitting off our plywood walkways by about, I don't know, a quarter inch, maybe a little bit more. Lots of holes in them, so the dirt would fall in there, but you couldn't actually vacuum the dirt out of there.
Yeah.
You couldn't get any suction to vacuum the dirt out of it. In the club I curl out of in Quebec, they had gone from plywood, just painted plywood, to like a plastic mat everywhere. It was a little bit slippery, that I don't think they liked. And then they finally hit on what are called horse mats. They're, I don't know, 1/2 inch to 5/8 of an inch thick. And they use them for in horse stalls where there's a concrete floor. And they're a little cushiony, but not very cushiony, and they have a surface to them. I don't know how well they held up. They had been in there 3 years the last time I had curled there, and they still were pretty good. Okay. It wasn't shedding anything like that. And it just had a surface to them that didn't seem to shed, but I can't say, how well that would work out in the long term. Broomstones right now, they've got like runner
carpets. Yeah.
runner carpets that seem
How
to
those work,
pretty
Dan?
well. I don't know
Dano
if
still with us?
I don't know.
Hello? I personally like carpet. I've been in a lot of clubs with the rubber. It's hard to keep clean. But a good loop carpet, as long as you vacuum it every day, twice a day if you have to, seems to work. The runners work. They're probably better than the carpet, but then they have.
Runners are nice, because then you don't have to worry about pulling your carpet up if you need to pull your boards up.
Yep. Yeah.
You want to make sure whatever you put down, that you still have easy access to your header trench or to your loops if you need them. So
Definitely one of the critical factors in dealing with this. So last question was, there's another thing here in the chat. Just a second, if I can you look at oh, here we go. All right. So our heating system has some problem going on. Any suggestions for scraping and pebbling changes if air temp is lower than desirable? Like mid to upper 30s air temp when it's very cold outside.
If you had a night setback system, I bet your building would stay warmer. If you can get that compressor off at night and warm your ice up, it would be very easy to keep that building warm.
yeah, exactly. Or if whoever's there just sort of, at the end of the night, you have somebody who can turn it up a few degrees.
Yeah.
Like Ian says, it'll keep the building a little bit warmer and the air temperature a little warmer. And when someone comes in the morning to scrape, it won't be quite so frigid. It'll be a little softer on the surface and a little easier to scrape.
Yeah.
It's kind of the opposite of what they do in kind of arena events when there's too much humidity. They kind of do the reverse, that overnight they'll curl the building way down. So this is just the opposite, and that kind of makes sense to me.
Well,
So there was
in the arenas, they're using the ice as a dehumidifier.
true. I agree. So one last question that somebody had submitted was, should a club be trying to maintain an ice temperature with as little fluctuation as possible? And is there some amount of tolerance that's recommended? And so I think the answer
That's
is
up to your
yes.
members.
The answer is yes. Okay. And
Yeah, I mean, ideally, you don't want your ice temperature to fluctuate at all throughout a game, you know. But realistically, you know, some clubs are going to get a 3 to 4 degree variation from, you know, depends on your system and all that. And some people know it. Some people know, oh, we get to the fifth end, it's warmed up, the compressor's kicked on, and now it's cooling down, so it's going to slow down a little bit. So some members get to expect that. But yeah, in an ideal world, your ice surface temperature would remain constant throughout the match, I would guess. Very difficult to do.
so it kind of depends on what your system is, and what its capacity ability to do something is. And also it depends a little bit on your ice probes. So one of the things when I got the broomstones, people were talking about that. And so, you know, when I would hang around the club, I would just record the temperatures every 15 minutes. We didn't have a system that recorded it all the time. So, but I just recorded every 15 minutes through a game and do it for a few games. And it gives you a good sense of what's happening during a game and how much your ice is changing, okay? Or at least that probe that we were using was changing, all right? So that's one way to get a sort of baseline of what's going on in your club. And then I'm not familiar with how new systems that people are using with their compressor systems work. At Broomstones, we put in a system from a company called Veraxis in Ontario. And Veraxis was designing systems for curling clubs. And basically, it works off your ice temperature. And it actually helped us a lot, even at a point in time when our compressor system was failing, right? And then additionally, they have a function called Cascade, which is an algorithm that works off your ice temperature and I think your brine return, Ian, is that correct?
Brine return and ice surface.
Ice surface. And so, and that algorithm helps pull it down a little bit more so that we were probably within about 0.4 of a degree over the course of a game. But again, I would say that was with what I would describe as a very weak and ready to go out the door compressor system. I don't know that they've been able to get that hooked up yet this season because of people not being able to cross the border, but I suspect once they get that hooked up with that new compressor system, they'll probably be able to hold it to below 0.4 of a degree for a game. So that's one system. There probably are other systems in the States that do similar things, but I'm just not enough familiar to say.
It's
What
gonna be
would
hard,
be
it's gonna be
some-
hard to beat that Veraxis system.
You know,
If you have a tight insulated building, that thing is pretty accurate. It's amazingly accurate.
And it really does. You just have to understand what your system is and what it's capable of doing. You know, and really how it works. You know, you can go to 10 different clubs and they're going to have 10 different types of compressor systems. And, you know, each one, there's a different way to manage it to kind of maintain your ice temperature. So.
you know, I have to say that at Broomstones, when I first started doing this, the first year I kind of tracked it a few games and tracked it. And then the next year we lowered the set point on the compressor system. And it was interesting to me that it didn't have the effect that I thought it would. And so it's worth tracking what you have as a baseline at the present time and see where you're at. And then as you make changes, you might be able to have some understanding of how changes affect things. I was thinking that when we lowered our set point, it would just bring everything down. And it didn't. It actually changed the graph, okay? All right. So it didn't just bring everything down, which was what I expected. But really, the graph changed quite a bit. And I actually, if you go and look on our ice support page, there's a survey, a report on the survey for dedicated ice clubs that we did. And on the cover, I think there, we've got a copy of that graph, and you'll see that there's 2 lines there. And one of them, we had pulled the ice temperature down a half a degree or something like that, and the effect was very different than what I expected it to be. So, any other questions that anybody has out there?
Yeah.
Anything we missed? Anybody sent in something that people feel like we missed that we didn't touch on? So I would just say as the last thing, thanks to Greg, thanks to Ian, thanks to everybody else for signing up. You all will get an email from Pete Della Pella. So sometime today, tomorrow, I would hope, not later than Wednesday. Check your spam box if you don't get one. And with an evaluation in there, and we really appreciate when people fill out the evaluations. There's a number of questions in there that you can rank on a scale of 0 to 5, and opportunity for you to leave some other specific feedback that you'd like to see or hear about. We value your participating in these, and we really evaluate the evaluations. They're really helpful in terms of helping us make decisions about how to change this to make this better for you all. So one other little.
One other question, Garrett just popped up a question and said, if you can't afford Veraxis, what's the next best thing? You know, there's a million different, again, it depends on what your system is. So, you know, if people out there have questions about your individual systems and your compressors and whatever you have, don't hesitate to reach out, you know, to myself or to Russell or to Ian. I'm sure we'd be happy to kind of, you know, talk to you a little bit and figure out what you have and see what might be a good, you know, a good solution for you. There's a lot of options out there. You know, really Veraxis is the only one that's curling specific as far as I know.
So I had thought about trying to go back and visit with Gary White in Utica, and there's a couple other places clubs that are fairly new, Nashua, Pittsburgh, possibly Mayfield. I'd seen sort of a little bit at Mayfield, but not enough to be able to answer that question, but to start looking and checking in with clubs that have new systems to see, you know, what do they actually got? What are they getting? What can you buy down here? What was recommended? What does it do? How well does it do it? Okay, because there are some overlays. I know at Mayfield, they have kind of an overlay that they can use, that they can get online, and it kind of looks a little bit like Eye on the Ice in a way, but just for their compressor system. So there are some overlays that you can have that go on top of systems that you can kind of look at things and be able to see, but I don't know exactly what systems are out there, so I can't speak to it. It's certainly an unknown and something that we probably need to find out more about if we can.
Yeah, and I encourage you to talk to your refrigeration specialist, whoever comes out and does the commissioning and the regular maintenance on your system, and let them know what your parameters are and say, hey, this is what we're looking to do. Is this something we can do? And if so, what do we need to do it? You know, those guys, the people who come and install and maintain your systems will know it better than anyone else. So.
And your parameters will be such when you're talking to regular refrigeration guys, a lot of their business is basically trying to stay between 1 and 2 degrees. You know, here we're trying to be down around 2/10 or 3/10 of a degree. So they think we're kind of nuts in some ways, but I agree with Greg. You can start talking to somebody like that and they would give you an idea of what are the available systems out there to kind of manage your compressor system, your refrigeration system.
So to try to fine tune your systems that are old and within a 1 or 2 point degree, play around your heat and your temperatures. So if you start out with 38 degrees, set your let's say your probe is on the slab. If your probe says 22, that could be 25 and it could be 18. You don't know what that probe really means. So play around your probe, put it up to 24, put it up to 25. Well, if the ice gets slippy, turn it down again. Try to figure out what that 22 means, or that 23 means, or that 24 means. Them things are not accurate, and just try to figure out what it means. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. I did run into something last summer from the Hilti company, which makes a bunch of construction equipment. So somebody I know who curls works for them, and that they've been using, they have these kind of Wi-Fi little things that they use. I'm thinking about how to describe them, but they record temperature and humidity, and they use them in construction sites for concrete pours, right? And I don't know how accurate they actually are, but we were thinking about trying to see how they would compare with sort of ice temperatures in a club where we both hang around a little bit, and to see how that might vary. I don't think they're all that expensive. They have to be pretty accurate because they make decisions about when it's okay to pull the forms on big concrete buildings, okay, and move up to the next floor. And they embed them right in the concrete, and they work by Wi-Fi, and it'll show up on your phone and tell you what you got. I think they're under $200 for one, something like that. All right. So that's another way to look at it. Another thing you could use is an infrared and compare that to what you're getting with your probe, your ice probe. All the probes are slightly different. Ian had pointed out to me that the probes that for Axis use are very sensitive. And that's partly what you have to know is how sensitive is the ice probe that you're using.
And how well calibrated too.
That's right.
Yes,
So-
yeah.
So it's a whole different universe for which it'd be helpful to know more, but
Another inexpensive way is just to go out and buy a fluke, calibrate it, put it on the
Yep.
ice.
a fluke actually would be better than an infrared, and they're about the same price in
Yep.
reality. And a fluke, I mean, you know, they use the flukes at the Grand Slams, and they basically, they attach the wires onto a coin and freeze the coin right in the ice and let it sit there. So, and I suppose you could just leave the probe and let it lay it on the ice and it'd be fine.
And I'll have another 50 probes out there that for show, and they'll go by the fluke.
So Garrett, I don't know which fluke model. There's a couple different ones. One of them I think was around,
52 or something like that is the one that a lot
Yeah.
of those guys use.
and one of them is like plus or minus. I think you got to look at the plus or minus sides of them too. So to get one that's a fairly low plus or minus, I think you got to get up above 500, but I think you could look at a couple different fluke models and see. I can't remember, but I looked probably a year ago, probably last summer sometime.
I have one in my truck. You want to give me 30 seconds? I'll grab it.
No, that's all right. You know what we can do? We can just send something out.
Yeah,
Okay,
we'll
if
send
you
something
let me
out
know
later
what,
with some of the
let me
tools
know
that
what
we use.
model
That'd be
you've
great.
got, and we can send that out to people after we're done here. But a fluke is probably a better option than I think an infrared.
Yeah, and don't be afraid. Spend a little more money on these instruments. The cheaper ones that you get at a Home Depot, they're not that accurate. They're not very well calibrated or consistent. If you're going to use an infrared, get one that you can change the emissivity on it. Because when you do it on ice versus something else, it's going to give you different results. So don't be afraid to spend a couple $100 to get a decent instrument, because it's going to last longer and it's going to be a little more accurate and consistent for you.
All right, well, we're past 8:30. This has been, I think, pretty good from our perspective. I hope it's been good for all of you. Again, I just want to remind you that you'll get an email from Pete Delapella. It's probably a Pete Delapella 52 at Hotmail, I think, with an evaluation form, a link to a Google form. And so if you would fill that out, we will greatly appreciate it. So with that, I would say, I think we're done. And again, thanks for everybody for stopping in, and we're going to stop sharing at this moment in time. And I guess we can leave with one more thank you to Dan for setting this up as usual and being a great host.
Thanks, Dan.
Hi, guys.
Thank you, Russell, for organizing it. Ian,
Not a
thank
problem.
you guys. Have a good night.
Glad to do it.